next speaker is Rick Sigsby, who will talk about his latest book, Living on the Edge, A History of Automobile Racing in Michigan. This 300-page book gives readers an inside look at Michigan's rich history in this sport and includes stories about many of the legends of auto racing from the first automobile race right here in Grosse Pointe Township, although now part of the city of Detroit near Chalmers and Jefferson, October 10th, 1901, when Henry Ford won his one and only race, and right up through the Brad Keselowski, I knew I was going to pronounce that wrong, winner of the 2010 NASCAR Nationwide Series, also from Michigan. The book includes over 40 personal interviews and 30 profiles of legends from the past and the present of automobile racing, and features over 100 photographs and interviews with two-time Indy winner Gordon Johncock and NASCAR stars such as Johnny Benson Jr. and short track Hall of Fame drivers, several of those as our speaker will mention tonight. Additionally, Rick interviewed automotive insiders such as Edsel Ford II and Herb Fischel, former GM director of racing, who will give the readers an understanding of the manufacturer's view of automobile racing. Rick grew up in Midland, Michigan. His first dream was shattered, he tells us, when he was still in elementary school, he had passed the weight and height maximum sizes for a jockey. He was a horse owner. We were just talking about it tonight, like the best days in a boat owner's the best days of the day he buys and sells the horse. Sells the boat, I mean, is the day, the same thing with horse racing, the day you buy and sell a horse, of course. So Rick might mention a little bit about that. He's a retired park ranger, but it's obvious that journalism and writing became an important part of his life, and he's worked and retired, and after retiring, during his work at this field, or after his work, he was a reporter for the sports editor of the Midland Daily News, covering cross-country, basketball, and track while he was still in school, and made sure the stories featured himself, right? Anyway, after earning a BA from Central Michigan in Health and Phys Ed, he received a Master's in Education from the University of Michigan, the horse racing that's where you met your wife Ann, correct?
Yes.
Oh, very good, okay. The culmination of several years of columns in the newspaper called the Rick Off the Record is the form for his book. First book, Discovering Hidden Treasures, in 2007. His second book was a pictorial look at one of mid-Michigan's most interesting counties, Images of America, Gladwin County, published by Arcadia Publishing in 2008, followed by his third book, The Valley of the Athletes, which chronicles the athletic history of the Saginaw Valley Conference, the oldest high school athletic association in Michigan. His fourth book was then Discovering Hidden Treasures Part 2, also from his columns. But of course, his latest literary adventure is tonight's subject, Living on the Edge, A History of Racing in Michigan, which may have never been written if Henry Ford hadn't won his first race here in Grosse Pointe Township. Rick, thank you.
Just a little overboard.
Well, is there anything I left out you want to add?
No. Make sure I have all my equipment here. Thank you for the very nice introduction, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here on such short notice, and I say that tongue-in-cheek because...
We spoke a year ago.
Yes. Last year, Izzy invited me over to the Historical Society home, and I did a book signing on one of Izzy's Saturdays and had a great time. And shortly thereafter, I got a phone call from the president of the Historical Society at that time, I believe.
No, I've only been chair of this. I've been president for over, first time in almost 15 years ago. But
oh, well.
Moving on. Moving on.
I got a call from Mike Skinner.
Excuse me. Just a chair.
He wanted to make sure that his schedule was full for the lecture series, and he asked me what I was doing on May 15th, and I said, well, I have to check my calendar, and he said, no, May 15th, 2013. And I said, you mean a year from now? And he said, yes, you shouldn't have any conflicts when it's a year out. And as a matter of fact, I hadn't had any conflicts. I'm glad to be here, by the way, because I wasn't sure when he asked me to participate. But yes, it is a pleasure, and we've had such wonderful conversations since then regarding Grosse Pointe and, of course, the history of auto racing in Michigan. Let me back up just quickly here. We were talking about Jeff Daniels at dinner. How many have seen Escanaba in the Moonlight? Okay, if you have, then you know who great-grandfather Sodi is. And he always said, if you don't know where to start, you go back to the beginning. Well, Mike covered pretty much most of the beginning as far as my writing is concerned. Actually, it turned out that I went to lunch with a publisher of several newspapers in the mid-Michigan area, and he knew my background, and he asked if I would be interested in writing for the newspaper, and I said yes. And he said, you can't write about horses every week. And I said, well, I certainly understand that, but that gravitated into Rick Off the Record, and it's a feel-good newspaper column about interesting people, places, and things. And part of the process was several of the interesting people that I came across were in my hometown and in our area in mid-Michigan. There are about half a dozen Hall of Fame race car drivers, all within a very short radius of the newspaper in my hometown. So I had a great opportunity to interview them. And one of them happened to mention a lack of information out there about the history of auto racing in Michigan. He said, you need to write the history of auto racing in Michigan. And I said, no, I'm not interested at all. And he said, why? And I said, because that implies a big encyclopedic-sized book that covers all of racing from the beginning of the invention of the automobile right up until the last Michigan guy that won a race. And he said, no, you need to write the book in the same style that you write your column, which is an interview style. And he said, I'm sure that you'll get great cooperation and you'll get a lot of people that would be interested in talking about auto racing in Michigan. So, just out of curiosity, how many people here have written a book? Okay, how many people would like to write a book? Okay, I will warn you before you start. You have to be very careful about the words you choose. And if you notice, the title of the book says, Living on the Edge, A History of Auto Racing in Michigan. Not the history, a history. And the reason why is because I can't tell you how many people have come up and said, is my Uncle John in the book? He raced in Michigan. And of course I never knew who Uncle John was. And then when I explained to them that no, in fact it's not a comprehensive history of auto racing in Michigan, it's just my version of the history. And I'm sorry I left your Uncle John out of the book, but that's just the way it happens. But to give you an idea, if you looked at the cover, in terms of writing a book, there is an evolutionary process. And you never know what the finished product is going to look like. This is actually the first picture that I saw that I envisioned the cover of the book looking like. And if you aren't familiar, that's a picture of Michigan International Speedway, one of their NASCAR races, taken just past the start-finish line. But unfortunately, NASCAR isn't the only part of racing in Michigan. So it had to evolve. So from there, I just took some of the primary characters in Michigan auto racing. If you'll notice, the red car is Brad Keselowski's Roger Penske car, and Roger Penske also happens to be a Michigander. And to the right is Henry Ford's race car. Behind that is Gordon Johncock's race car, and then Ray Haroon's race car. And that went to almost like a cartoon-like drawing of the same picture. And then when you go out and you find a friend that happens to be an artist who you think is going to do the illustration for free, you find out that it actually costs you a lot of money. And he won't do it for free. But anyway, I think that the cover came out very nice. And I will also add my contribution to the cover. If you look really close, you'll see that the drawing actually goes from pavement to bricks to dirt. And that was my contribution to the total drawing.
I thought you were going to say that was you instead of Oliver Barthel riding with Henry Ford.
I would have if I would have been around. But no, I wasn't. I'm old enough. No, I'm not quite that old. But anyway, yeah. I think it turned out really pretty well. I call it kind of my back to the future look at auto racing in Michigan. This is the back cover. And as you know, the title of the book is Living on the Edge, and these are the two photos that I came up with that certainly basically illustrate what race drivers would call living on the edge. The picture on the far side is a picture of Johnny Roberts in 1967 in an ARCA race down at Daytona. And this was back before ESPN. This was back before 24/7 sports that you could get anytime. But that actually made the 6 o'clock news, national news. And if you look real close, you can see his arm and his head coming out, which was prior to them putting up the netting. I think if you want to go on YouTube, you can YouTube the video of it. And I tried to slow it down as much, and I think it was 7.5 times that he flipped over. And believe it or not, 10 days later, they poured him into his pickup truck, and he drove himself back to Breckenridge, Michigan. So, Johnny just passed away here this last Christmas at 85 years old, and up until 83, he was still driving a truck. So, he just loved to be out on the road. The other picture is a picture of Gordon Johncock's cousin, Nolan Johncock, at Oswego, New York, in what they call a super modified race car. And according to the people that were there, he cleared the Curtis sign. So, certainly living on the edge, I would think. Going back a little bit further, the first automobile race on a track was actually in Rhode Island, in the Narragansett horse racing track at the time. 7 cars were entered, and it was an electric car that won. I think it was something like 5 laps in 15 minutes, something like that. But 60,000 people showed up, believe it or not, which is kind of amazing. But at the time, automobile racing certainly was a novelty, to say the least. Henry Ford was quoted as saying, auto racing began 5 minutes after the second car was built. And I will state emphatically, I'm not an expert on auto racing by any means. I'm not an expert on the Ford family. But I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so ask away. On the far side is a very famous picture of them racing in 1901, right here in Grosse Pointe. It was a spectacle, I guess is about the best way to describe it. Automobile racing was very new. As a matter of fact, having counted, and here's something else for authors, when it comes to research, Google is a wonderful search engine. It's wonderful. But I will forewarn you, don't give up on page 2. I say that because by page 2, you're already starting to see repeats from page 1. By the time you get to page 3, it's pretty much all repeats from page 1 and page 2. But some of the best tidbits of information I've found on 4 and 5. So I caution you, just don't give up just because you start seeing repeating articles over and over. But at the time of this race, I stopped counting at 12 newspapers that were in Detroit at that time. I would estimate that it was probably as many as 24 when you count weeklies and monthlies and so forth. But for the automobile industry, there was not one reporter from any of the newspapers that covered the automobile industry in 1901. That's how new it was. And they didn't think it was all that important to cover the automobile industry. So the only way that actually car manufacturers had to promote their product was to put on these exhibition races. This was an extraordinary exhibition race. And I say that because at the time of this race, this was the last race on the program. It was very well publicized. Depending on who you hear the information from or where you read it, it was anywhere between 8,000 to 15,000 people attended the race. It was an all-day event. People took the day off of work. It wasn't easy to get from Detroit to Grosse Pointe at that time. It took a little while. And as a matter of fact, a lot of people came by boat because it wasn't that easy to get here. But it was very well promoted. The race itself actually took place. It was supposed to originally be a 25-lap race, but they shortened it to 10 laps for really two reasons. One, because the program lasted a lot longer than they thought it was, and they also thought the local guy named Henry Ford was going to get his butt kicked pretty bad, and they didn't want him to get humiliated, so they shortened the race thinking that it would be a lot more competitive. There were actually, the world record holder at the time was there. The man that is being passed, his name is Alexander Winton. He set the world record earlier in the afternoon, so at the time of this race he was the current world record holder. And then of course we talked about the mechanic sitting next to Henry in his car, which was called Sweepstakes. And when the 100-year anniversary came up for the race, they got the car out of mothballs, and ironically they thought it was a replica, but when they started doing the research they actually discovered that it was the actual car that Henry Ford drove in 2001. I mean in 1901, and they were really pretty excited about it, and I guess I don't blame them. They have since made several replicas of that car, and Henry Ford was not really a very good record keeper, and as I understand, his original garage burned and a lot of the paper burned with it too, but I think they display that car very proudly, and it is in the Henry Ford Museum too, so that's something that you can go see. If anyone has this at home, please let us know. This was the first prize for the race. It was a crystal bowl and cup set that actually was personally picked out by Alexander Winton because that was what enticed him to come to Detroit and race. They said, if you will come and race, we'll allow you to pick out the trophy. And he thought it would be a nice gift for his wife, but he didn't win the race. And I guess as it turns out, after Henry Ford passed away and they had an estate sale, that was part of the estate sale, and it was not documented very well, and they didn't really understand the historical significance of it. And it ended up in New York somewhere, in a shop in New York, and since then they've kind of lost where it's gone. But I believe Etzel has said that they would very much be interested in getting it back. There's no reward, but they still are very interested in getting it back. This is a picture of Henry Ford and Barney Oldfield in the famous race car, the 999 race car, which was named after a New York Central extremely fast locomotive. As the story goes, they hired Barney Oldfield to drive the car. Actually, when he got here to Detroit, his two prototypes, of which one was this car, the 999, wouldn't start. And so it ended up one of Henry Ford's investors and Barney Oldfield bought both prototypes for $800. They tinkered with it for a couple weeks and started racing it around the country. It has a very significant part of the history of the Ford Motor Company, although once it passed to Barney Oldfield and several other people, actually Henry Ford had very little to do with the race car after that. This is a picture of Henry Ford and two of his drivers winning the transcontinental race from New York to Seattle. And it was in the Model T. It took somewhere around 23 days to complete the race, but I think it probably is almost as significant as the 1901 race because they promoted the heck out of it. And what they promoted wasn't the speed, it was the durability. And you can only imagine what the roads were like in 1909. So if you had a car that actually was fairly durable, it was a lot more important than how fast it went. And again, it was a very significant event in the history of Ford Motor Company, of which at the time when he won the 1901 race, he got investors that started the Henry Ford Company that quickly, or I should say shortly thereafter, the board of directors took over because Henry Ford wasn't really that good of a businessman. And it eventually became the Cadillac Company. So, a little bit of automotive history there. And if you bought a Model T in 1910, what color was it?
Black. Not black.
Well,
Not black.
actually,
No.
the light bulb. Actually, the light bulb for Henry Ford came on in around 1913, and he realized that he was cranking out all these cars and painting them these wonderful colors, but they were going to buy his car anyway. And it was much cheaper to paint it black. Black paint dried a lot quicker, so he could make a lot more cars. And so from 1914 to 1928, that was the only color you could buy it in, was black. But prior to that, you could buy it in multicolors except black. See, now those are one of the things you learn when you Google these things. You come up with this information. I think one of the things that I really loved to hear when we were sitting down to dinner was talking about the Ford family being the royal family of Detroit. And I couldn't agree more with that. Of course, Henry Ford on the upper left, his son, his only son, Edsel, then Henry II, and of course, Edsel II. What a family. This is a pretty special car, and I'm not going to profess that I know anything about it. There's already an expert back there that's gone all over the country with this car, which was Edsel Ford's Speedster, or Special Speedster, that was built in 1934. It has a very ironic, colorful history. It has passed through multiple hands, but the Ford Motor Company was very proud of this. Edsel Ford was very proud of this car. They toured the car all over the country in the Depression and into to the 1940s. For whatever reason, it ended up being lost and passed on to multiple hands. I read somewhere that a sailor down in Florida bought it for $800 or something like that back in the 50s. And it transferred to actually a car enthusiast who had it completely restored and painted red. And then it was rediscovered. It came into the possession of the Ford Foundation, or actually the House estate here. And they returned it to its original color, which was gunmetal gray. Is that what they call it, gunmetal gray? So it really doesn't look like this anymore. It's a gray color, but just to give you an idea, this is what it looks like. And of course, that's Edsel II at the wheel. Looks like he's enjoying himself, and I believe that was at Pebble Beach. Yes, okay.
Where is it now?
It was out in the garage.
Oh, okay.
Definitely the scoring, right?
We're going to have a big celebration for it to come back home. It's actually in, we had to take it back to Arm Restorations, who did the restoration, because we needed to change out the tires, and the tires are very complex. I had to take the fenders off, et cetera, et cetera. So it is coming back from Ontario, and it will be heading to Nashville to be on exhibit at the First Museum this summer.
But contrary to rumors, you will not be driving it in the Memorial Parade.
Contrary, yes. It won't be in the Memorial Day Parade.
No.
Okay, the first Indianapolis 500 was in 1911. And what was the qualifying speed?
60?
60, 95, actually right in between. 75 miles an hour. You had to maintain that speed for 1/4 mile. Go. And ironically, if you're not aware that the Speedway is now called the Brickyard, the reason why it's called the Brickyard is, you can see in this picture, it actually was dirt originally, but when they built the racetrack, it was very unsafe. The sanctioning body at the time was AAA, and they actually told the owners if they didn't do something about it, they would bar them from racing there. So they came up with this idea of paving it with about 3 million plus bricks. Today, the only thing that's left is a patch of bricks at the start-finish line that's about this wide. But it's still known as the Brickyard. One of the fortunate things, Ray Haroon, a Michigan a person, won the very first Indianapolis 500 in 1911. I had the opportunity to interview his son before he passed away. And Dick told me some fabulous things about not only his dad winning the Indianapolis 500, but about automobile racing in general. And he told me things like there were no rules for breaking down. Most cars had their mechanic right with them, so they would stop right in the middle of the track to work on their car. Or in case of needing gasoline or tires, they would turn around and drive the wrong way of the track to get back to the pits. You know, just strange things like that. But you can also understand why automobile racing was very dangerous from the very beginning. On the top, that's a picture of what he was known as the Little Professor, Ray Haroon. He won, as I said, the very first Indianapolis 500. Retired immediately, moved to Michigan, and started the Haroon Motor Company in Wayne, Michigan. Quite an interesting man. One of the interesting things about his race car, it was the Marmon Wasp, and if you look at it, it does look like a wasp. But he did things that no one else had ever done before. He offset the engine for weight distribution. He actually did tire testing, which was basically unheard of. But before he started the Indianapolis 500, he went to Firestone and asked them how many miles he could go, how fast he could go before he needed to change tires. And they told him that he could go 75 miles an hour maximum. And he won the Indianapolis 500 at 74.7 miles an hour, something like that. One of the other interesting things that I learned was today, when you enter the Indianapolis 500, it's 200 laps around the racetrack. When someone finishes 200 laps, wherever you are, that's the position that you end up in when somebody finishes 200 laps. But back then, you didn't get paid, and it wasn't considered a sanctioned race until you went 500 miles. And Dick told me that his dad told him he was home with the trophy, enjoying his victory, while there were still guys out there trying to fix their car so that they could finish the 500 miles and get credit for it, which I found kind of interesting. The other thing that he did too, which if you notice, there's nobody sitting beside him. There was a huge uproar over that because they thought it was totally unsafe. He thought it was just made common sense. You didn't have to carry a passenger, a lot less weight, but they were very concerned about that. And so they were actually going to disqualify him. So he took the car off the line, went back to the garage, and welded on a rear view mirror. So it actually was the very first car to have a rear view mirror. And the other thing Dick told me, which I found fascinating, was he filed a patent, but in the patent papers he admitted that he had taken the rear view mirror from a horse carriage. And because it was already on a vehicle, he didn't get the patent right for having a rear view mirror on a car. The far gentleman is Gordon Johncock. He won the Indianapolis 500 2 times. And literally now he lives in the middle of nowhere, and he loves it. He owns a sawmill, loves to be out in the woods, has absolutely nothing to do with auto racing. There's a Gordon Johncock suite that sits empty every year at the Indianapolis 500, and I told him I would go down there and sit in it, but he didn't take the bait. But a very gracious man, a great interview. And his wife said that she cringes when there's an automobile race on TV because he cusses and swears and throws things and swears that he can beat everybody out there still today. So, the gentleman here in the lower right is Murray Rose. He won the Indianapolis 500 3 times in the 40s. Retired, went to work for General Motors. And the ironic thing about Murray was a very humble man. When he passed away, over 3,500 people attended his funeral. An overwhelming majority of them were his co-workers from General Motors, and an overwhelming majority of them never even knew that he was a race car driver. He just never said anything about it. But certainly he had a lot of things to brag about when he won the Indianapolis 500 3 times. Okay, he was the first driver to go 60 miles an hour, first person to go 100 miles an hour at Indianapolis. He set the world record 1, 2, and 5 miles at Daytona. Any idea? Barney Oldfield.
You know what he said of Henry Ford? Mr. Ford, I made you and you made me and I did a better job.
Well, actually, what the way the quote went was when Henry mentioned that you know, they kind of made each other, so to speak, in the automobile industry. I made the cars and you went out and raced them. And Barney said, yeah, but I did a damn sight more for you than you did for me. But one of the things, Barney Oldfield was one of the very first athletes to market himself. And there was a lot of Barney Oldfield merchandise out there, including Barney Oldfield cigars, which he was very famous for, smoking during a race. But one of the lines that you would hear quite frequently if you happen to be going a little bit too fast out on the road and a policeman would stop you, he would say, "Who do you think you are, Barney Oldfield?" But yeah, he was a great promoter of himself.
I'm curious, did Barney Oldfield ever get pulled over by a policeman?
You know, I would say I would doubt that.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's only speculation on my part, but I would also say that he probably would have just handed him tickets to the next race or the next exhibition and just went on his way, you know. But at $4,000 an appearance, you know, you think about that back in the teens, that was a lot of money. That was an awful lot of money. Hall of Famer from Imlay City, just north of here, was the World Speed King, and he held the speed record from 1911 to 1919. I don't expect too many of you to know this, but his name was Bob Berman. Now that was the car that he actually went almost 142 miles an hour in 1911.
Not with a crown on.
Not with the crown on. Not too much safety equipment either, as it looks.
Chain drive,
You know, it looks like it
the
is.
jack shaft right there.
Yeah.
Chain drive,
Yeah.
jeez.
He actually had his first race in 1904, right here in Grosse Pointe, and driving a Jackson. How many people have ever heard of a Jackson automobile from Jackson, Michigan? They didn't make too many of them. But it says on his grave he drove for Buick, a Buick driver without peer on the track. He knew no fear. And I can say emphatically, that was one of the things that was a topic of conversation with a lot of people, race car drivers, talking about fear. And for the most part, if they ever experienced any kind of fear at all, they knew they were done. And that was the turning point in their racing career. And most of them just hung their helmet and driving gloves up. And I can say it's unbelievable how fearless these guys are. And I'm not talking about just Bob Berman. I'm talking about, you know, the Brad Keselowskis of today. And there's a lot more safety equipment on those cars today than there ever was back then. Just prior to Bob Berman, he died in a race in California. A couple weeks before that, he attempted to set the world record again along the beach in California. His car caught on fire and he swerved out into the ocean to put it out. So, I mean, those are the kind of things you encounter. Okay, he was a cab driver in Detroit, went on to win the Winston Cup in 1973. Any ideas? Benny Parsons. Won the Daytona 500 in 1975, was a fantastic race car analyst before he passed away, and voted one of NASCAR's greatest drivers, which is quite an honor. I have talked to his crew chief, Ray Young, still alive. He said that they, when they were kids, raced up and down Woodward Avenue quite a bit and would go back and exchange the tires from Benny's dad's cab company until they got caught one night and Benny's dad said, that's enough, you get out and earn your own keep. So that's when they became race car drivers and went to the track. Now again, this is something that I don't expect you to know, but in the stock car world back in the 70s, there were two cars called Going and Gone, 60 and 61, Tommy Myers and Ed Howe. Tommy Myers is from Midland. Ed Howe was actually one of the very first columns that I wrote for the newspaper. It was called Whatever Happened to Ed Howe. And Ed Howe was from Beaverton, Michigan. When I was a kid, I would go out and see his Green, Green is not a very popular car in the race car world. They're very superstitious about it. Ed Howe got a 5-gallon bucket of paint from his employer and went out and slapped it on his car so no one would pit near him. He thought it was pretty smart. Both guys are still alive today. They're the direct. I can say emphatically they are the direct opposite. Ed, I'm not sure he ever took a drink in his life, of alcohol anyway. Tommy Myers is still parties pretty hard. He at 71 years old. And Ed had a crew cut. Tommy always had a comb in his race suit. So, but they could race. And interestingly enough, you can't see it in this picture, but they used to put tape on the door of their car. And the deal was, whoever got to the first turn ahead, the other wouldn't challenge until the last lap, and they always tried to line that tape up so they could finish in a dead heat. And Tommy admitted that he thought they had done that many, many times, but none of the promoters would ever give it to him. So, but that was the deal. And the reason why I put these guys in here is because, as I said in the previous slides, Benny Parsons won the Winston Cup, which now it's called the Sprint Cup. Prior to that, it was the Nextel Cup. It was called the Grand National at one time. It's all the premium racing in NASCAR. But in 1973, these two gentlemen went out and won $140,000 racing on a short track. Benny Parsons made $48,000 winning the Winston Cup in NASCAR. That's how much it's changed, though. Now it's $1 billion business. It's changed quite dramatically. A couple of these guys you might recognize. The upper left there is Louis Chevrolet, one of the brilliant minds in automotive history, one of the poorest businessmen in automotive history. The man could have been a multimillionaire many, many times over, but had a quick fused temper and usually liked to work by himself and really lost many, many fortunes. When Billy Durant hired him as an engineer, he was paid in stock primarily with a very low salary. They got into an argument and Mr. Chevrolet sold his stock back to Billy Durant, and if he would have hung on to it for about 18 more months, it would have been worth about $10 million. Same thing happened to him with the AC Champion Spark Plug Company. He worked with the gentleman that owned that, was paid in stock, got into an argument, sold the stock back, and he would have been many, many times over a millionaire. He actually, other than he was named Chevrolet, he never owned the name Chevrolet in his entire career. and basically died working for General Motors in the 40s, a very poor man. The gentleman on the right, Paul Goldsmith, and I don't expect many of you to know him, but he's probably one of the most legendary race car drivers in Michigan history. He's 86 years old. He owns his own airport in Indiana now. He was one of the very first NASCAR drivers to fly himself around the country. But he also was the only person to win a major motorcycle race on the beach at Daytona, and he won the very last stock car race on the beach at Daytona. So that's quite a distinction. The gentleman on the lower left, the cat in the hat they call him, Jack Roush, got his start in drag racing. Now he's an owner with multiple cars in NASCAR, in all of the series.
He should stop flying himself, though.
Yeah, they call him the cat in the hat, and the reason why is because he's used up
9
about
lives.
7 of the 9 lives that he's had. Of course, the gentleman here in the lower right is Roger Penske, one of the all-time great promoters of auto racing right here in the Detroit area. A big fan of racing. I didn't personally interview him for the book because his staff couldn't figure out what country he was in. That's how busy he is. After winning the championship, he said, "I have something for Roger's birthday. It's hard to get a present for a billionaire." That was Brad Keselowski. His family, the Keselowski family, grew up in Rochester. K Automotive was their team. This is a picture of living on the edge, I guess. This was at Talladega, and one of the races that Brad won. Now, since this, he has gone on and he won the Sprint Cup last year. And he is, I would say, probably the poster boy for the redneck NASCAR crowd. If you recall, when he won the championship last year, he stood in the winner's circle with a tall boy of Miller Lite, and when they interviewed him, he finally had to stop and say, "I've had enough, I'm getting a little bit drunk." So, at least he was pretty honest about it. This gentleman's name is Cy Fairchild, and he was one of the men that I interviewed. He's one of the very first drivers to qualify for the Indianapolis 500 and the Daytona 500 in the first year, in the same year. I put this picture of Cy up here for 2 reasons. One, he was the one that actually talked me into writing the book. And 2, one of the stories he told when he was racing in Chicago I thought was fantastic. He was dating a girl that was a stewardess at the time for United, and she said her girlfriend, who also was a stewardess at the time, wanted to know if they could hitch a ride to California, because that was where Cy's next race was. He had this nice, beautiful Cadillac convertible back in the 60s, you know, with the big fins on it. And so it was actually Cy and his girlfriend and her girlfriend and his boyfriend at the time, headed for California. He said they partied for 3 days going cross country, and when they got to Los Angeles, he turned to the gentleman and said, "Jim, where would you like me to take you?" And Jim said, "Would you take me to Warner Brothers Studio?" He said, "Sure." And he got out of the car, and Cy's girlfriend at the time said, "Did you know who that was?" And the guy says, "This is Jim." You know, and she said, "Well, didn't you once tell me that your favorite show was Maverick?" And he said, "Yeah, well, it was James Garner that he'd driven all the way across country with." These are the Ruttman brothers. On the left is Joe Ruttman, who still test drives for a lot of teams. Today he lives in Tennessee, but they both grew up in the Detroit area. I got a hold of Joe on his cell phone coming back from Daytona, back to his home in Tennessee, and basically he kept me on the phone and kept me laughing for almost the entire state of Georgia. one story after another. On the left is his brother Troy, his older brother Troy. And again, here's probably one of the most legendary race car drivers that very few people have ever heard about. Troy was the youngest winner of the Indianapolis 500 at age 22. he won the Indy 500. Unfortunately, his mother, many years before that, had forged his birth certificate, and that was the 4th time that he had raced at Indianapolis, and you had to be 21 to enter the race. So, on his 4th try, he won it as the youngest driver. The other interesting thing is there used to be a race called the La Herrera Pan America race, and it was a race the length of Mexico. It was a 5-day race. And they don't do it anymore because it's too dangerous. And they only ran it about 6 times in the 50s. And the second time Troy Ruttman ran in the La Herrera race, he bought a Mercury off a used car lot for $1,000 in California, drove it down to the race, and finished second to a factory-sponsored Ferrari. And he only lost by 20 minutes in a 5-day race. But that's how good he was. That's really how good he was. This is a picture of Johnny Benson Sr., who is it's a very famous family on the west side of the state, Grand Rapids area. Great family, great interviews. Johnny Benson Jr. still races today. One of the interesting things that John Sr. told me about, he raced primarily in the Midwest and raced primarily in the super modified class. But he also raced in the stock car class every once in a while. He was a legend in the Grand Rapids area. The owner of the Berlin Speedway put together a package for him to go down and race at MIS in one of the NASCAR races. And they did it with the intent of thinking that they would bring probably a couple hundred people from the Grand Rapids area down there to watch him race. And I asked him, I said, you know, this was really your one and only shot to race against Richard Petty and Cale Yarborough and A.J. Foyt and all the legendary names of stock car racing. What was it like? And he said, it was fantastic. He said they were such gracious race car drivers. He said, about every 5-10 laps, they would pass me and they'd wave. Okay. Do you recognize this track?
State Fairgrounds.
Yes, the State Fairgrounds. Yes. From 1899 to 1966. Isn't that a fabulous picture, though?
Yeah.
Believe it or not, they spruced the track up in the 30s, and a horse named Seabiscuit raced there several times. There. They had NASCAR races there in the 50s. They've tried pretty much anything that would go around an oval track at one time or another there. And I believe it was 2001 they finally tore the grandstands down. So there won't be any more racing there. How about this track? This was at 8 Mile and Shane. Motor City Speedway, yes. Look at that picture in 1940. Now I was told that the police shut them down because cars were parked out on 8 Mile Road to come to the races. Isn't that fabulous? The gentleman that took that picture, his name is Al Blixt. I would encourage you to go on the website, his website, and look at the photos. He took all of his father was the track photographer for Motor City Speedway. And Al Jr. said that he grew up at the racetrack. He said they had a concession stand under the grandstands, and all of the wives of the drivers and personnel that worked at the track all ran the concession stand, so they all mothered him. And he said he would take his popcorn and Coke and go up and sit in the stands, and when it was time, somebody would come and get him, and they would put him in the back seat of the car with his pillow. He'd go to sleep, and that's the way he grew up. That's the way he grew up. Here's a picture from 1950, and the track lasted from 1932 to 1958.
I grew up on Mack Avenue and Alter Road, and on a hot summer night, you could hear those cars.
You can hear them, yeah.
I remember hearing them too.
Yeah, in the 1950s, this was, if you look, they called that the jalopy class. This was really prior to what now we would call stock cars, but it was called the jalopy class. One of the pictures that I didn't put in here was a gentleman named Jack Goodwin. You may have heard of him. He's a very famous race car driver from the Detroit area. He lives in Florida now. And Jack had a lot of fabulous stories about Motor City Speedway. And he called me up and he said, Rick, he said, could you change the interview a little bit? And I said, well, sure, Jack, what would you like changed? He said, I said hell and damn a lot in there. And I said, well, Jack, hell and damn are in the dictionary and they're in the Bible, so they're going to stay in the interview. He said, well, okay, but he said, right there at the end, he said, I said I was hauling ass. And he says, people in my church are going to read that. And I said, well, I can sympathize with you, Jack, but I said, if somebody in your church says something about you hauling ass, you just tell them that Jesus rode an ass into Jerusalem. He goes, okay, leave it in there. All right, how about this track? Mount Clemens, very good. Very good.
I remember.
There's a picture of it in 1962. There's a picture of it in 1985. If you know where the Gibraltar Trade Center is, that's where Mount Clemens Speedway. And actually, if you go into the back, you can see some remnants still of the track back there. But that's what exists there now today, right off of 94, the Mount Clemens Speedway. And there's a lot of great drivers that have a lot of great stories to talk about Mount Clemens Speedway. Here's another one of Al Blick's pictures. Again, kind of, yeah, living on the edge. And as I say, you know, they didn't even have seat belts. They put ropes to hold themselves in because of the centrifugal force. They put ropes around their waist to hold themselves in. They didn't have a roll bar. If they did have a roll bar, their shoulders and their head stuck up higher than the roll bar, so it really wasn't worth too much. The only thing that the word daredevil comes to mind, I guess, is in describing how they existed out there on the racetrack. Here's another one of his pictures that he took. This one was just, as it was described, moments before, and I can't remember the driver's name, but it was a fatal accident. And that was one of the interesting things that I asked Al about, because you know, you realize, you can see the one driver is cutting through the infield, and this guy was out there with a camera taking pictures, you know, so it was pretty dangerous to be a track photographer even out there. And when I interviewed Edsel, I asked him about that, and his first trips down to Indianapolis 500. He said the Ford photographer invited him to go down to Indy with him. And of course, there was a photographer stand right off the first turn, right past the pits and the inside grandstands. And he said, we stood there, he said, of course, the start of the Indy 500 is one of the most dangerous times. You know, you've got 33 cars all vying for position in that first turn. He said there was a horrendous crash. He said the only thing I can remember was a tire going by my head, you know, just feet. I mean, he thought it was inches, you know, from it. He said it was the most scared he'd ever been in his life. You know, but there again, you don't even think about the spectators. Here just a couple weeks ago, there was a horrendous crash at one of the racetracks where the car got actually up into the fence, and unfortunately it hit right where there was a gate. So parts of the car got into the grandstands. You know, many people were injured. I mean, it was especially in the early days, it was very, very dangerous for spectators even, you know, to participate in that. One of the people I interviewed was Roger Curtis, for president of the Michigan International Speedway, and it was an interesting perspective of getting a person's position on things like crowd control, things you don't think about. He told me that the year that he took over at MLS, it was 5 hours from the time the race was over until the last car that wanted to leave. You know, and a lot of people camp there and stay right there, but he said it was 5 hours from the time the race ended to the time that the last car wanted to leave, got out of the parking lot. So the next year, he went to the director, DOT. He went up in a helicopter. He asked his advice, and he said the guy was pointing and saying, "Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? How come you're not doing this?" And Roger's comment was, "Well, because I don't have the authority to do those kind of things." Like, for instance, changing the direction of traffic. Yeah. When the race is, before the race, it only goes one way, towards the track. When the race ends, it only goes one way, out to the expressway. So he said, "I don't have the authority to do that." He said, "Well, you do now." And now he's got it timed from the time the race is over until the last car leaves. It's about an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes. So things have changed quite dramatically. MIS is still doing very well. Overall, racing is down quite a bit, attendance-wise. But the two big NASCAR races that MIS has now, they're still maintaining somewhere around 100,000 people there. And it's pretty amazing to see 100,000 people at a car race. My wife and I have been there, and I can tell you can't hear a damn thing. It is unbelievably noisy. You pray for yellow flags, because then they line up all at the same time. And then when they take off, you can talk for about 30 seconds before they come around again. But then 10 minutes later, they're all spread out, and you can't hear anything again. So this is what an author looks like when he's finished a book.
That's when you shave?
This is what an author looks like when he hasn't finished his book. As Mike very eloquently mentioned, the first book I did was called Discovering Hidden Treasures, and very interestingly, I actually came up with this cover idea I wouldn't say it was in a dream, but it was in that hazy time when you're not quite awake yet and you're thinking of these things. And I thought it would be a good idea to get all the people that I interviewed together and just take a picture of them, because they were my hidden treasures. And I actually invited 24 of them to come and have their picture taken. 22 of them showed up, which maybe they just wanted to be in print. I don't know. But, and I did entice them with, I think, a bottle of champagne or something to finish off the book. But the second book there is, as Mike said, the Valley of Athletes. It's a history of the oldest high school athletic conference in the state of Michigan, from 1904, I believe, up until the book was published in 2011. And there are several old that started earlier than that, but the Saginaw Valley has consistently stayed active. Matter of fact, there are two in the Detroit area that are older, in terms of, but it's intermittent. And the Saginaw Valley has existed for over 100 years. And many, I counted over 200 athletes from the Saginaw Valley Conference that have gone on to fantastic college and professional athletic careers. Of course, the cover is Jim Abbott. You might remember he was a major league pitcher, was born without a right hand, and went on to pitch for 10 years in the major leagues, pitched a no-hitter when he was pitching for the New York Yankees. We were talking about where we all went to college. I'm a mixed marriage. I went to the University of Michigan, and my wife went to Michigan State, so it's a mixed marriage. But she was very upset that there happened to be a Michigan man on the cover, so I put a Michigan State athlete on the back of the cover. Who happened to be a world-class sprinter, a guy named Herb Washington, who now owns about 60 McDonald's restaurants in Ohio and New York. But the third book is, again, a continuation of kind of the interesting people and places and things that I've discovered all over the state of Michigan, including politics. Believe it or not, some politicians out there are fairly interesting people. Yeah, it was. I've enjoyed doing that. The last book is Images of America, Gladwin County. The interesting thing about this cover, we ran across this picture. This was a homestead family from Gladwin. And one of the people that I interviewed was a gentleman that was a World War II vet in the Navy. Talked about his experiences out in the Pacific. And what are the flights called? Honor flights. Many companies have sponsored honor flights to go to Washington, D.C. to see the new World War II memorial. And Bob was one of the people that was selected from Gladwin County to go on one of these honor flights. So I interviewed him. And I was talking about coming out with this new book, and I showed him this very interesting picture that I discovered that was going to be the cover for the Images of America. And his wife came out of the kitchen and said, "Do you know who that is right there?" And I said, "No, who is it?" She said, "That's my father." I thought that was kind of interesting. Yeah, she said, "That's my father. That's the Kuntz family." She said, "We homesteaded in Gladwin County." Which I, again, found pretty fascinating. This is the next book. It's Michigan's Holy Water, the Great Lakes Wine Bible. I have been reassured by my brother-in-law, who's a Presbyterian minister, that the religious right probably won't picket my driveway. But I'm going to hold him to it. Actually, there are over 100 wineries in Michigan, believe it or not, and all over the state. In the strangest places, I know everybody thinks about the Traverse City area, Old Mission Peninsula, Leelanau Peninsula, or down in the Paw Paw, Michigan area. There's quite a few wineries down there, but there's wineries right here in the Detroit area too, cropping up. There's 4 wineries in the UP. There's 2 wineries in Alpena, so they're all over the place. And this is one of the posters that we put together that kind of shows the colorful wine industry, with their wine labels. And I guess, do we have time to open it up for some questions, Mike?
Questions? A couple minutes anyway. If you just, Ma'am, go ahead.
I might have missed this, and I apologize if I did, but where did they race in Grosse Pointe?
Actually, it's Chalmers and Jefferson area now. Grosse Pointe Township went all the way down to Waterworks Park. It was actually, but it was the Detroit driving.
The Detroit Driving Club. Yeah. And there's been a little mild controversy in that there was also a horse racing track that was quite near there. So there was a debate as to which track that they did actually hold the race. But I think there's been enough documentation that it's the Grosse Pointe Driving Club that was down on Chambers, just off of Jefferson, that was there for quite a few years.
Would that have been at the southwest corner of Jefferson and Alter?
No, it was further in.
Farther west?
Yeah.
I was told there was some sort of a track. It touched Kirby Road, and it was to the south of Kirby.
That was a horse.
That was a horse track.
Oh.
Yeah, that was a horse track.
Thank you.
Yeah. And, you think about it, prior to 1900, that was the mode of transportation. So there were a lot of horse tracks here in Michigan. Yeah, there were a lot of horse tracks, right here in the Detroit area. Anything else? Yeah.
Are there any items in there about the drag racing that has gone on in the Michigan?
No, I didn't put anything in drag racing for 2 reasons. One, drag racing doesn't look like cars anymore. They're pretty far from. Now, if we go back to when I learned how to drive, most of the drag racing cars looked like the cars that were out there on the street. And they still do have drag strips here. And a lot of very famous drag racers from Michigan. Connie Coletta's from Michigan. Shirley Muldowney is from Michigan. Yeah. This was primarily oval racing, though. Primarily oval racing.
Great. Well, Rick will be signing books. We've got the Historical Society books, the Grosse Pointe books, the Historical Society selling our videos. And I really want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Josephine, anything else?